But as you can see, over the last couple of months, we've begun to see, for example, in existing home sales, some improvement, and at least a bit of a turnaround and improvement in starts as well. The third factor that was at work as the fear of the double dip arose was certainly Europe. And the European situation, you can see this is the standard measure of fear in the market. It's the difference basically between LIBOR and Fed funds. And what you see here is that the summer outbreak of fear was certainly subdued compared to anything we saw over the course of the financial crisis itself. And just in terms of the impact on GDP of fixing all of this up, the Bank of Canada recently released some estimates of the loss of GDP, which is 0.1% for the US, 0.4%, 0.3%. These normally would be marginal numbers. When you're only growing 2% or 2.5%, even these numbers hurt in terms of lost GDP. But maybe the point is they're not really pointing toward a loss to a double dip. The concern really about Europe should be that a real crisis, a real external shock to an economy growing as slow as the US can knock us right back into recession. And it doesn't have to be Europe. It can be any kind of external shock from oil markets or a terror attack or whatever. We're certainly vulnerable if we're only growing at 2 or 2.5%. These consensus forecasts from the Philadelphia Fed or blue chip indicators are basically pointing to the exception to the guitar string rule. Growth subdued at 2.5% and unemployment remaining high for quite a while. What sets us apart is commodities and oil, petrochemicals. We're looking at a better picture, certainly in terms of the rebound in oil prices. Both the run-up from 2003 to 2008 was not just oil. It was ag raw materials, metals, food prices, and we're seeing that same kind of increases now in commodity prices. The primary driver for the commodity boom from 2003 to 2008 was the developing world and the growth of the developing world. The increase in consumption during that period was for oil, 90% of it from the developing world, 90% from metals growth, 80% from food. Dollar depreciation, I think just in the last few weeks has become a factor in the commodity prices, but certainly could be counted as an issue today, although I think the primary driver remains that growth of the developing world. Global growth in 2009, this is the recession I talked about. 40 years of consistently tracking global growth. This was the first downturn, the first contraction in worldwide growth we had ever seen. But look at 2010. It comes back at close to 5%, and 2011 is another mediocre year on a historical basis, but one of growth. The developing world in recent years has led the growth. It's leading it now. And it's what the IMF has called a multi-speed recovery, where we have the split between a very slowly growing developing world and a developed world in Europe, Japan, and the US, and a developing world that's growing quite rapidly. In fact, we're talking about, and this is the consensus, the developing world acting as an engine of growth for the rest of us. Now, how can it be that Walmart's not doing well and China is all at the same time? It's about them developing their own internal markets, rising standards of living, and beginning to compete with us for the commodities around the world. They have a rising share of the global economy, about a third of the world's trades among these countries, and they have had a very resilient policy framework, balancing budgets, independent central banks, massive foreign exchange reserves to present the kind of outbreak of financial crises that have plagued these countries in the past. The world as a whole is probably doing better than you think, certainly if you look again at the consensus forecast. And this is what brought the price of oil back up to $80, $80, $75, $80, $85 in recent days. This is, in fact, there are very few projects in the world you cannot justify at $80 per barrel. The global commodity oil is doing really great right now. World demand, it staggered in 2009 with the global recession. It's come back, and it has come back led by the developing world. Very little of the increase, again, in demand will come from the developed world this year. What that has done is it's brought the global search for oil, which largely is conducted outside the United States. The global search for oil is back above the prior peak. This, plus strong land drilling in the U.S., has really virtually offset most of the effects of the Gulf moratorium for service companies here in the Houston area. This combination of strong global drilling and a good solid land market in the U.S. has really offset many of those effects. Now, I can tell you a different story if we look at the local commodity, the one that's not traded globally, and the one that depends on the U.S. economy. Look at the price of natural gas, which has been in this period when there's been no Gulf hurricanes, no significant weather to move it over the fall, has fallen to about $3.50. Now, 15 years ago, when I started as an economist here in Houston, we all knew oil was supposed to be at $20, no matter where it was, and natural gas was at $2, no matter what the price actually was. It should be $2, and that it was underpriced. Natural gas was underpriced because it was domestic and not traded. And so you had this 10-to-1 ratio, which everyone thought was greatly exaggerated and gave gas tremendous advantages. We now have $80 oil and $4 gas. That's a 20-to-1 ratio, which reflects the difference in the strength, again, between the global economy and here at home. Drilling has actually popped back fairly nicely in the United States. That return of drilling, however, has been driven maybe by some non-economic factors. One, it was really cold last winter, and a lot of producers were able to put in place hedges that have lasted up until just about the last couple of months, and they're now running off. And also, the switch to shale, they had leased up significant amounts of land and were forced to drill to maintain those leases. That is also slowing. We have seen natural gas-directed drilling really begin to slow over the last 6, 8, 10 weeks. And we're expecting a soft landing, but the rig count is increasingly unlikely to rise. The other big factor driving the domestic rig count has been a swing away from gas-directed drilling toward oil. In the United States, over the last 10 years, up until this crisis, about 80% of drilling in the U.S. was directed to natural gas. We're now seeing a swing away from natural gas, and about a little over 40% of drilling in the United States is now being directed into the oil market. In places like Permian Basin, Midland, Odessa has seen the rig count quadruple over the last 6 or 8 months. A little bit of ingenuity, a little bit of luck, a little bit of talent, and oil at $80 per barrel, and suddenly they have discovered a field of 1 billion barrels literally underneath the cities of Midland and Odessa. So the commodity prices really can help. There you see the switch to oil-directed and the switch to very service-intensive drilling. Both oil and natural gas are increasingly service-intensive. We're unlikely to see the rig count ever go back to the 1,600 rigs searching for oil that we had before this downturn. However, the work that is being done is very service-intensive and good for the service companies here in Houston. Price is going to be under pressure. Pray to freeze a few Yankees in the dark this winter. We need the inventories are a good 10% above normal now, going right into the heating season. Again, it matters. The price of oil matters in Houston. You see some 30,000 jobs, the best paying jobs in Houston, being added over that period of sharply rising oil prices, and you can see those prices, those jobs recovering. You see stability returning in the service companies, and the producers in Houston, the Exxons, the Shells, have continued to consolidate into the city and to really hoard skills which are increasingly scarce in the oil field. So I think perhaps if this last election got rid of some of the policy uncertainty, we could see a swing back to where we could actually talk about Houston as last in, first out. In other words, if we're a commodity-dependent economy and we're seeing a slow national recovery, but a fast global recovery driving those commodity prices, breaking that cycle where we have to wait for the global economy, for the national economy to recover before we recover, that's the signal that we can possibly move ahead. But it's the policy uncertainty that continues, and I think really going to make it difficult. We're seeing things work out at Clear Lake now. Most of those projects are moving back on track. Perhaps cap and trade has been put back into the bottle. And so still issues that surround health care and the Gulf moratorium are going to have some impact. But we've offset much of the Gulf moratorium with work elsewhere. So Houston may finally be back in the position where it can swing a little bit ahead of the U.S. economy and do better as we move forward.
All right.